A foreman chasing. A draft found a family walled inside the old bunkhouse. The wind came under the door again. I'd stuffed a feed sack against the gap 3 times that fall, and 3 times it had worked loose and the cold had come back in like it owned the place. Which, this time of year, maybe it did. I was down on one knee pulling the sack into place when I heard it, a sound from outside that wasn't wind, wasn't the horses settling in the corral. Something else, something low. I stayed on my knee, listened. There it was again, from the direction of the old bunkhouse. Now the old bunkhouse hadn't been used since Calhoun quit, and took his 3 men with him 2 summers back. Roof needed work. One wall had gone soft where the ground stayed wet, and I'd been meaning to tear it down before it fell on something. But I hadn't gotten to it, and it sat there at the far end of the yard, the way neglected things do, gray and settling, reminding me every morning I walked past that I had one more thing I hadn't done. I pulled my coat off the hook, stepped outside. The yard was cold and quiet. November, or close enough. The big house was dark. Emmett Gale had gone to Tucson for the winter, same as the last 3 winters, leaving me to run the Gale spread through to March when the hands came back. It was just me and old Prout most of the time, and Prout wintered in the bunkroom off the tack house and slept like a stone from 8 till 5 and didn't bother me and I didn't bother him. The moon was up, half of it anyway, and the yard had that flat white look it gets when it's cold enough to bite. I crossed toward the old bunkhouse. The sound again, clearer now. A child. A small child, not quite crying, that sound they make when they're too tired to cry all the way. I stopped at the door. It was shut but not latched, and there was light inside, a thin yellow line at the bottom, which meant a lamp, which meant someone had been in there long enough to find the lamp and have oil for it. I knocked, which seemed strange given the building was mine to maintain, or at least mine to be responsible for, but I knocked anyway. Silence, then the light went out. I stood there a moment, pushed the door open slow, and said I wasn't going to hurt anyone before I even got inside. What I saw was a woman standing with her back against the far wall, one arm out and a child tucked behind it, and another child, older, maybe 8 or 9, standing beside her with a look on his face like he'd already decided what he was going to do if things went wrong. The room smelled of old straw and lamp oil, and something they'd been cooking, beans or cornmeal, something hot in a pot on the old wood stove they'd managed to get going. The woman said, "Don't come any closer." I didn't. I stood in the doorway and let the moonlight come in behind me so she could see I wasn't holding anything. I asked her how long she'd been there. She didn't answer. I asked if the children were all right. She said they were fine. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, some kind of bracing, the way a person sounds when they've been bracing for a while and have gotten good at hiding it. I looked at the boy. He was still watching me with those flat, calculating eyes. He had a piece of iron pipe in his hand, I noticed. An 8-year-old with a piece of pipe, standing between me and his mother. I felt something in my chest that I didn't have a word for. I said, "It's cold and I've got a kitchen in the main house." I said I'd go in and get the fire up and leave the door open, and if they wanted to come in, they could, and if they didn't, I'd bring something out and leave it by the door and they could do whatever they wanted. Then I went back to the main house. I don't know why I did it that way. Felt right. You don't corral something that's already in a corner. That was the beginning of it. Not a promising one maybe, but beginnings are like that, they don't announce themselves. You find out later what they were. I've been running cattle since I was 17 years old. I've worked spreads from the Pecos up into Wyoming, and I spent 6 years on the Gale Ranch before Emmett trusted me enough to leave me alone with it. I knew livestock and I knew land and I knew how to manage men, though managing men was never the thing I was best at or liked most. What I liked was the work. Early mornings, late light, the steady accumulation of things done right. A fence that would hold. A herd that came through winter without losses. A well that didn't dry up in August. I didn't need much else. I was 44 years old and I lived alone, and that suited me most of the time. Her name was Clara Beach. I found that out the next morning when she came to the kitchen door, came to it, not through it, stood on the step with the younger child on her hip and the boy at her knee, and told me her name and that she wasn't a thief and that she'd pay for what they'd used if I could tell her what it was worth. I told her to come in out of the cold. She was maybe 35, hard to say. Dark hair, gray starting at the temples, not tall. There was a quality to her stillness that reminded me of certain horses, not broken, but wary in a way that had once been pain and had since become habit. She held that younger child the same way the boy had held his pipe, like she'd hold on to it past the point of reason if she had to. I put coffee on, set out what was left of the bread from the day before. She sat down at the table and didn't eat and watched me, and I could feel her watching me, and I kept my back to her more than I needed to give her time to settle. The boy ate. He ate the way a boy eats when he's been going without, quietly, without looking up, like he was afraid someone would notice and take it back. The little one, the one she'd been holding, turned out to be a girl, 3 or so, curly hair and a face still round with baby fat. She fell asleep against her mother's shoulder inside 5 minutes. Her name was Nettie. I found out in pieces, over the next hour, the way you find things out when someone is still deciding how much to trust you. Her husband had been dead 11 months. Not from anything particular, a bad fall from a horse, and then a fever, and then it was done, faster than anyone expected. They'd had a small place outside of Redfield, 40 acres her husband's brother had helped them get started on. After the husband died, the brother-in-law had taken the position, and he had a legal case for it, or so the man at the county seat had told her, that the land reverted to him since the original stake had been his and there was no will. She'd contested it. She'd lost. She and the 2 children had been put out of the house on a Wednesday in late October with what they could carry. She'd been moving since, working where she could find it, sleeping where she could manage it. She'd heard of Gale Ranch from a woman in Redfield who said it was reputable. She'd been walking toward it for 3 days when she found the bunkhouse unlocked and the children too tired to go further. I listened to all of it, and I didn't say anything until she was done. Then I told her she could stay. She looked at me in a way that said she was waiting for the rest of it, the condition that came after, the thing she'd owe. I told her there was no rest of it. The bunkhouse roof needed work, but it was holding for now, and the stove worked, and she was welcome to it through the winter while she figured out what came next. I told her I'd see to it she had food, that I was provisioning for a long winter anyway, and it was no burden. She said she didn't take charity. I told her I'd need help in the kitchen, which was true enough. Emmett's cook had gone south with him, and I'd been putting up with my own cooking since October, which wasn't fit for a man with any self-respect. If she'd do the cooking and keep the main house from falling apart while I was out on the range, we'd call it an exchange, and nobody would owe anybody anything. She studied me, those steady gray eyes. Then she said, all right. The boy's name was Thomas. Tom. He was 9, I found out, not 8, and he was the kind of 9-year-old who'd been forced into the shape of something older. He didn't play. He helped. He watched how I did things, and he did them the same way, and if he made a mistake, he didn't need to be told twice. He was the first one up in the mornings, and he'd already have kindling split before I got to the woodpile. It took me about a week to understand that he'd appointed himself the man of his family. 11 months since his father had died, and this boy had decided the job was his and gone about it with a seriousness that would have broken your heart if you let it. I didn't let it, I just let him be useful. There's a thing I believe about boys like that, boys carrying weight they shouldn't have to carry yet. You don't take the weight from them, because they've built themselves around it and you'll only knock them sideways. What you do is stand beside them until they can feel that the weight is shared, and then one day they put some of it down on their own because they've realized they don't have to carry all of it alone. It takes time. It takes not making a thing of it. Tom was also the one who watched me the hardest. Clara watched me too, but differently. She was measuring me for trustworthiness, adding things up. Tom was watching me for something else. I didn't know what for a while. I figured it out one afternoon about 2 weeks in. We were mending a section of corral fence on the north side of the yard, just the two of us, and he was handing me nails without being asked, keeping pace the way good help does, and I said something about how the post was going to hold now for another 5 years if we'd sunk it right. And he looked at the post and said, "How do you know how deep is deep enough?" I showed him. We dug 2 more posts together that afternoon, and I told him what I was looking for in the ground, how deep you needed to go and what kind of soil, what to do when you hit rock, how to tamp it so it didn't rock in wet weather. He listened to all of it the way you listen when you're trying to memorize something. That night at supper I caught Clara watching him, and then she looked at me, just for a second, and something passed across her face. Gratitude is too soft a word for what it was. Relief. The kind of relief you see in a person who has been managing everything and has just, for one small moment, been allowed to not manage everything. I looked back down at my plate. Prout found out about them within a day of their arrival. A spread this size, in this quiet, a fire in the old bunkhouse was notable, and he said nothing about it except to tip his hat at Clara the first time he saw her, and to keep his distance generally, which was his way. Prout was a man who had long ago made his peace with the world as it was and didn't see the point of commentary. I was glad for that. I didn't want to have to explain something I hadn't finished explaining to myself. What I'd told Clara was true. I needed the kitchen help. But I won't pretend the kitchen help was the whole of my thinking. I don't know exactly what the whole of my thinking was. I just know that when I'd stood in the doorway of that bunkhouse and seen that boy with his piece of pipe, something had settled in me that I hadn't known was unsettled. I'd been running the Gale spread alone for a long time, long before Emmett started wintering in Tucson. Even when the hands were here, I was alone in the way men who run things are alone. You're surrounded by people who work for you, and that's different from having people around you. Emmett was a fair boss, and I respected him, and we got on well, and once in a while we sat on the porch in the evenings and talked about cattle or weather or the price of beef, and that was the extent of it. My family was gone, parents both gone before I was 30, a brother dead in the war, a sister somewhere in Illinois I hadn't written in years. I'd been engaged once, to a woman in New Mexico, and then I hadn't been, and I hadn't let myself think too hard about why, because the answer wasn't something I could change. I was a capable man who ran things well, and asked nothing of the world, and the world gave me back exactly what I asked for. That's a clean way to live. It's also a kind of poverty. The first time she scared me was about 3 weeks after they arrived. Not scared in a way that had anything to do with her or any harm she might do. I mean the other kind of scared, the kind where something gets close enough to matter, and you feel the fact of it against your ribs. I'd been working on the barn door track, a job that wants 3 hands because you're holding the door and guiding the iron runner at the same time and driving the pin home with the other, and there's no good way to manage it alone. I'd managed it before. That afternoon I didn't manage it as well, and the door came back on me harder than I'd planned, and the edge of it caught my left hand against the door frame and opened a cut on the heel of my palm that bled more than it needed to. It wasn't serious. A cut is a cut. I wrapped a cloth around it and came into the kitchen for coffee, and Clara looked up from the counter, and her eyes went straight to the hand. She said, "Let me see." I told her it was fine. She put down what she was doing and came over and held out her hand. I've been managed by women before. My mother could put you in a chair from across the room with a look, and my aunt, who raised me for 3 years after my mother passed, had the same quality. Clara had a version of it, not commanding exactly, more like certain. Like there was a version of events where she looked at the hand, and there was a version where she didn't, and she'd already decided which one it was going to be. I held out my hand. She unwrapped the cloth, looked at the cut, turned my hand over and back. She'd gotten her tin down from the shelf in the bunkhouse sometime in the first week and moved it to the kitchen, and she went to it now and found something, a small paper packet, dried something, and she put water on to heat, and she cleaned the cut, and she pressed something against it that stung like fire, and I sat there and let her. Her hands were steady. She worked the way she cooked, without fuss, paying attention to the thing itself rather than to the fact of doing it. She had calluses I could feel through her own skin, the edges of them. She had a small scar on her right thumb I hadn't noticed before. When she was done, she bound it with a strip of clean cloth she'd cut for the purpose. She said, "It'll be stiff tomorrow." I said I'd manage. She said, "I know. I'm telling you, not warning you." She tied the end of the cloth. She was still holding my hand in both of hers to keep the knot, and she didn't release it immediately. She looked at what she'd done. Then she looked up. She said, "You work too hard." I said that seemed like the pot calling the kettle. Something crossed her face, not quite a smile, but the edge of one, and she let go of my hand and went back to the counter. I sat there a moment before I got up. I knew then, not in the way where you say a thing to yourself plainly. I hadn't gotten there yet, but in the way where your body knows before your mind catches up, like the way you know a fence post is going wrong before you can articulate what you're seeing. Some knowledge announces itself with a sound, and some of it just settles in like water finding its level. I drank my coffee and went back to the barn. November turned. The cold settled in properly, not the cold that nips at you, but the cold that means business, the kind that comes down from the north with a gray sky behind it and stays. I spent most of my days out on the range, checking line, watching the cattle, making sure the windmill on the east tank hadn't frozen up. The work was the same as any other winter, just me and Proot and the land and the cattle and the long cold light. But I came home to something now. That's a plain way to put it, and I'm not sure it captures the whole of it. I came home to a kitchen that was warm and smelled of food, and to a table set by somebody other than me, and to Nettie, who had decided by the end of the first week that I was acceptable and would sometimes fall asleep on the floor near my boots while I sat at the table in the evenings. She slept the way small children sleep, completely, the way falling off a cliff is complete, and I would look down at her and then look out the window at the dark and feel something I wasn't going to name. Clara cooked well, better than well. Not fancy, she wasn't working with much, but she made food that was good in the specific way that food is good when the person making it has been hungry and takes the feeding of people seriously. There was always more than enough. She fed Proot too, without being asked. Just sent Tom out to the tack house with a covered plate in the evenings. And Proot came to the kitchen door one morning specifically to tell her it was the best biscuit he'd eaten in 20 years, which from Proot was a speech. I found out she'd done some nursing. Nothing formal, but in Redfield she'd been the one people called when someone was sick and they didn't want to wait for the doctor who was 3 hours away on a good day. She knew plants, what to dry and keep, what was useful for what. She'd brought a small bundle of dried things with her when they left, wrapped in a cloth, tucked in with the children's extra clothes. She kept them in a tin on the shelf in the bunkhouse, and she knew every one of them and what it was for. I don't know why that stuck with me. Just the image of her in the middle of losing everything, making sure she had that tin. The second week of December, I came back from the far east section of the range later than I should have, having spent more time than I'd planned resetting a fence line that a steer had pushed through. The temperature had dropped while I was out and the wind had come up, and by the time I got the horse put up, and my hands functional enough to work the latch on the barn, I was cold in a way that goes down into the bones and sits there. I came into the kitchen, and Clara was at the stove. She turned when I came in, and I must have looked worse than I thought, because she said something quiet to Tom, who was at the table, and Tom took Nettie by the hand and they went out without fuss. She made me sit down. She got the coffee and she got the basin of hot water from the stove, and she set them both in front of me without ceremony, the same way she'd do anything else, and told me to get my hands in the water. I did. It's a particular kind of pain, warming hands that have gotten that cold, a burning that means the blood is coming back. I sat there and breathed through it, and she stood across the table with her arms crossed and watched me the way a person watches when they're making sure you're all right and aren't going to say anything about it. After a while she said, "You should have come in earlier." I told her I had fence to fix. She said the fence would have been there tomorrow. I didn't say anything to that. She went back to the stove, got supper on. We ate when Tom and Nettie came back in, the four of us at the table, and the food was hot and the lamp was lit, and the wind was doing what it wanted outside, and in here it was warm. I thought I could get used to this. And then I put that thought away, because it wasn't mine to have. I want to be straight about this next part, because it's the part I didn't handle well. Clara had been on the Gale spread for about 6 weeks when a man named Gerald Prout came looking for her. Prout was the brother-in-law. I was in the yard when he rode in, a thick man on a roan horse, and he had the look of a man who's used to being the biggest thing in whatever room he's in. He asked me, was there a woman named Beach on the property? I told him I didn't know that name. He looked at me, looked at the bunkhouse, looked back at me. He said he had paperwork that gave him guardianship of his late brother's children on account of their mother being unfit. I held on to that word a moment, unfit. I told him I'd need to see the paperwork. He patted his coat but didn't produce anything, said he'd be back in 2 days with the county sheriff to execute the order. I told him that was fine, that I'd be here and he could talk to whoever he needed to talk to. He looked at the bunkhouse again. Something in that look I didn't care for, a proprietary look, the look of a man accounting for what he considers his. He rode out. I went to the bunkhouse. Clara was at the door before I got there. She'd heard the horse, seen him from the window. She had that look on her face again, the braced one, but harder now. I told her what he'd said, all of it, including the word unfit, which I hated to say. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said she'd known he'd come. She'd known it since Redfield. I asked about the guardianship order. She said there was a man in Redfield, a friend of Prout's, who sat on the county board. She said Prout had told her when he put them out of the house that he'd get the children eventually, that she was unfit because of her condition. I asked what condition. She said she'd lost some time, the spring after her husband died, 3 or 4 weeks where she'd been low and not herself, and she'd needed help from neighbors, and Prout had used it against her. That a woman who couldn't manage herself couldn't manage children. She said it in a flat voice, the way you say a thing when you've said it to yourself so many times the edges have worn off. But I could hear what was underneath it. I told her not to worry about the paperwork. She said, Cal, which was the first time she'd used my first name. I've been not worrying about paperwork since October and it keeps showing up. I said I meant I'd handle it. She looked at me for a long time, then she said why. And I didn't have a good answer ready, which is not a position I'm comfortable in. I said something about the children being no trouble and the work exchange being fair, and it being the right thing to do, which was all true and also not the whole of it, and she knew that and I knew she knew it, and she let it pass. She went back inside. I stood in the cold for a while, and then I went to write a letter to the county seat myself. Prout came back the next day, without the sheriff. He rode in late afternoon, when the light was already going orange and flat. I was in the corral working the bay gelding, and I saw him come through the gate, and I kept working the horse because a half-finished thing left at the wrong moment sets you back further than stopping would have cost you. I made Prout wait. After a few minutes, I tied the gelding and came to the fence. Prout had gotten down from his horse. He was a big man, I'll say that, not soft, whatever else he was. He stood with his thumbs in his belt and looked at me like a man who expects other men to shift to accommodate him and is mildly surprised when they don't. He said he'd been thinking about our talk. I said he didn't look like a man who'd spent the night thinking. He said he wanted to make me an offer. He said if Clara signed over the deed rights to the 40 acres in Redfield, which he already had legally but apparently wanted confirmed in writing, he dropped the guardianship business entirely. The children could stay with their mother. No more legal trouble. I looked at him. I said that's what this is about, the deed. He said the deed was rightfully his, and she knew it, and a signed confirmation would just tidy things up. I said, and the guardianship order is a way to squeeze her into signing. He didn't say anything, which was an answer. I told him to get off this property. He looked at me for a long moment. He said, she's nothing to you. She showed up a month ago, you don't know her. I said I knew enough. He said, think about what you're getting into before you. I said his name. Just his name. Not loud. Sometimes that's enough, saying a man's name directly and quietly in a certain way, so he understands that you are done with the conversation and the next move is his. He got back on his horse. I went inside and wrote 2 letters that evening, one to Emmett's lawyer and one to the county seat directly, detailing the nature of the guardianship filing and the relationship between the magistrate who'd signed it and Gerald Prout, and the conversation in the corral that afternoon, which put the leverage plainly on paper. Clara came in while I was writing the second letter. She saw the paper and the ink, and she stood behind me for a moment without saying anything. Then she put her hand on my shoulder briefly and went to check on the children. I sat there a moment with the feel of that hand on my shoulder. Then I finished the letter. I'm going to skip the rest of the next part because it was mostly paper and waiting, and one unpleasant conversation with a county man who came out a week before Christmas, and who left again understanding that Gerald Prout's paperwork had a problem with it, namely that it had been filed in a county where Clara had never resided, and in front of a man who had a demonstrated personal relationship with Prout, which made the impartiality of the proceeding questionable at best. I'd found that out from Emmett's lawyer in Tucson, whom I'd written to directly, which might have been overstepping but which was also necessary. Prout came back with his sheriff, as promised. The sheriff was a thin man named Ordway who seemed embarrassed by the situation, and who read the paperwork I handed him carefully, and then had a quiet conversation with Prout at the edge of the yard that I couldn't hear, but which ended with Prout's face going a particular shade of red and Ordway tipping his hat at me, with an expression that said he was glad to be done with this business. Prout looked at me before he rode out. Just looked, the kind of look that's meant to tell you it isn't over. I looked back at him. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because it matters. I wasn't afraid of him. That's not false confidence, I just wasn't. What I felt was something simpler and more solid, something I hadn't felt in a while. I felt needed. Not in the way you feel needed when you're the foreman and there's a fence down or a sick animal. That kind of needed is about competence, about being the one who knows how to do the thing. This was different. This was a woman and 2 children in that bunkhouse who needed someone to stand between them and a man who would take what wasn't his. And I was the one standing there. I was the right man in the right place, and I knew it. I don't say that with any swagger. I say it because it's the honest thing. After years of running a ranch for someone else, of being capable and responsible and largely invisible, that moment felt like being seen. Not by anyone out there in the yard, not by Prout or Ordway, just by the fact of the situation itself, by the weight of it. I went back to work. Christmas on the Gale Ranch that year was not a thing I'd given much thought to in previous years. I'd been here 4 Christmases before this one, and I couldn't have told you what I'd done on any of them. Eaten something, slept, gotten up and done the work. The land doesn't stop for holidays, and neither do I generally. That year was different. Tom had asked me about a week before whether there was a pine up on the ridge above the north pasture. He'd seen it from a distance and wanted to know. I told him there was a good-sized one too, grown up in a hollow out of the wind and doing well. He nodded and didn't say anything else. The next morning he was up before me, which took some doing, and he had his coat and his boots, and he was heading out the door when I came into the kitchen. I asked him where he was going. He said up to the ridge. I asked what for. He hesitated like he hadn't thought I'd ask, and then he said he wanted to cut a branch. For his mother. I got my coat. We went up together, the two of us, in the early gray before the sun properly came up, and it was cold and quiet the way winter mornings are quiet, just the creak of frozen ground and the far sound of wind up on the ridge where it was always blowing. The boy didn't talk much on the way up. Neither did I. We walked at the same pace without having to settle it, the way two people walk together when they're comfortable. The pine was where I'd said it was. Tom stood in front of it and studied it for a while the way he studied most things, seriously, like there was a correct answer to be found. Then he picked his branch and I held the tree steady while he cut it with the hand saw I'd brought, and he was careful about it, cut it cleanly, not torn. He carried it back down himself. Clara put it on the table in the bunkhouse. I don't know what they used for ornaments. When I went over Christmas morning to tell them breakfast was ready, the branch was decorated with strips of cloth and 2 or 3 buttons, and a small piece of tin she'd bent into the shape of a star, and Nettie was standing in front of it with her hands behind her back and her face full of a 3-year-old's complete and solemn amazement. We ate Christmas breakfast in the main house, the 4 of us, with Prude at the end of the table because Clara had gone and asked him, and he hadn't been able to think of a reason to say no. She'd made something with dried apples and brown sugar that I don't have a name for, but that tasted like something from a different life. A life that had kitchens and families and mornings that weren't just mornings, but were specific and good. I gave Tom a decent knife. The kind a working man carries, not fancy, not cheap, good steel. He took it with both hands and looked at it and then looked at me and said, "Sir," just that. I told him sir wasn't necessary. He said, "Yes, sir," which made Clara put her hand over her mouth. I got Nettie a piece of hard candy from the supply store in Redfield, which I'd thought was inadequate, and which turned out to make her unspeakably happy for approximately 4 hours. I didn't get Clara anything. I'd thought about it and hadn't been able to figure out what was appropriate, which bothered me more than it should have. She didn't say anything about it. But after the children were back in the bunkhouse that evening and I was sitting at the table in the main house with the lamp turned low, she came to the door and knocked and came in when I said to. She set a piece of paper on the table in front of me. I looked at it. It was a drawing, not a finished one, rough lines in pencil of the ridge above the north pasture, the hollow where the pine was, the tree itself. The line of the hills behind it. It was good. It was better than good. It looked like the place. I asked if she'd drawn it. She said she used to draw more. She hadn't done it in a while. I said you should. She looked at the drawing for a moment. Then she said, "Merry Christmas, Cal," and she went back out. I sat at that table for a while looking at that piece of paper. Then I folded it carefully and put it in my coat pocket, because I didn't have a better place for it, and I wasn't ready to put it anywhere else. January came in hard. 3 days of genuine blizzard, the kind where you string a rope from the house to the barn so you don't lose yourself on the 20-yard walk. I'd done it before and I'd do it again, and it was simply the work of winter, nothing to be dramatic about. You made sure the livestock were all right, and you stayed close, and you waited it out. Clara kept the stove going in the bunkhouse, and I kept the one in the main house going, and the main house was warmer. So on the 2nd day of the blizzard, I went over and knocked and told them to come in out of the cold. She said the bunkhouse was fine. I said the main house was finer. She looked at me for a moment, and then she got the children up and they came over. The 4 of us spent 2.5 days more or less confined to the main house. Tom read. He was a reader. I'd known that, but I hadn't known quite how much until he went through 4 of my books in that time methodically, one after another, sitting in the chair by the stove with his feet tucked under him. Clara mended things. She seemed to be constitutionally unable to sit without doing something with her hands. There was always a needle or a pot or a cloth. Nettie colonized a corner of the floor with a collection of small objects she'd carried from the bunkhouse. A smooth stone, a button, a broken spur she'd found in the yard and taken a liking to, and arranged and rearranged them with the deep seriousness of a general planning a campaign. I made rope. Prude had brought in 3 months' worth of raw hemp before the blizzard, and I worked at it in the afternoons, hands moving through the twist, the kind of repetitive work that lets your mind go wherever it wants to go. On the first night of the blizzard, Nettie got sick. Not badly, a child's chest cold, the kind that sounds alarming and mostly isn't, but she woke up coughing at some hour deep in the dark and couldn't stop, and I woke to it from the other room and lay there listening the way you listen when you can't do anything and aren't sure you should try. Clara was already up. I could hear her moving, the low sound of her voice, the particular tone a mother uses when she's settling a child, not quite words and not quite song. After a while, Nettie stopped coughing. I heard the stove being opened, something being added. The smell of something, cedar, maybe, or some kind of dried bark working through the air. In the morning, Nettie was eating breakfast without complaint, a dried apple color in her cheeks and nothing more. I asked Clara what she'd done. She said she'd made a steam with some of the cedar bark and one of the other things from the tin, and held Nettie over it until her chest loosened. She said it was something a woman in Redfield had shown her, an older woman who knew plants. She said it mattered, learning what was useful. I said yes, it does. She looked at me. I meant it more broadly than just the plants, and I think she knew that. That was the way of most things that winter. The meaning was in the plain thing being done, and in the fact that it was done without asking. She never waited to be asked. She never needed to be told twice. She did the things that needed doing quietly without making a performance of it, and then moved to the next thing. And I did the same, and the days ran together into a life that was, for the first time in a long time, a life rather than just a continuation of one. It went where it went. On the second evening, after supper, after the children were asleep on the cot I'd set up in the back room, Clara came and sat at the table. We'd had evenings like this before, her at the table, me across from her or across the room, a lamp between us, and they'd been quiet in a comfortable way, not the quiet of two strangers who don't know what to say, but the quiet of two people who don't need to fill silence. But this evening she said, "I want to tell you something." I set down the rope. She said, "When we first came here, when you told me we could stay, I didn't believe you. I mean, I believed you meant it then. But I've been put out of more places than I've been welcomed into these last months, and I kept waiting for the thing that would change it. The condition that would come up later, the thing you'd want that you hadn't said at the start." She was looking at her hands, then she looked up. She said, "It hasn't come, and I need you to know that I know that." I said something about it being no trouble, which was honest but also insufficient, and I knew it. She said, "It's more than no trouble. Tom," she stopped. Then she said, "That boy has been trying to be a man since his father died, and you've been letting him be a boy who's learning things from a man. Do you understand what that is?" I said I thought I did. She said, "I don't think you do." She didn't say it unkindly. She said it like she was trying to make me see something I'd looked past. We were quiet a while. Outside, the blizzard was doing what it was doing, the particular muffled roar of heavy snow against walls, a sound that makes everything inside feel more particular, more accounted for. She said, "I'm 34 years old, and I've been a mother and a wife and a widow, and I've been hauled across a county in front of a magistrate to be called unfit, which I am not. I'm not soft, and I'm not fragile, and I don't need someone to tell me I'm good. But I need you to know that I see you. What you are, I see it." The lamp was between us. She was looking at me directly, in the way she had of looking at a thing, steady and without pretense. I said, Clara. She said, I know. I'm just saying it so it's said. And she got up and she went to check on the children, and she came back, and we sat by the stove for another hour and didn't talk much more, and it was one of the best hours I've had. I should say here that I am not by nature a man who talks about his own feelings. This isn't pride, I'm not putting it forward as a quality. It's just what's true. I learned early that the work speaks or it doesn't, and if it doesn't speak then you haven't done it right and talking about it is no substitute. My father was the same way. His father probably was too. It's the kind of thing that passes down without being said, which is fitting. What Clara had said to me that evening, what I'd felt sitting across from her at that table, with the blizzard outside and the children asleep and the lamp between us, I didn't know what to do with it. I knew what it was. I'm not stupid and I'm not blind, but knowing what something is and knowing what to do about it are different, and I'd spent a long time not doing anything about the things I knew. The thing that had ended in New Mexico, years back. Her name was Frances. She'd been a good woman and I'd cared for her, and I'd told her I'd be back in 6 weeks, and I'd been gone 8 months, because the cattle drive that was supposed to take 6 weeks had gone sideways, and then south, and then sideways again. And when I got back she'd married someone else, and I couldn't fault her for it. But I'd faulted myself. I'd been a man who did the work and figured everything else would wait, and it didn't wait, and after that I'd stopped letting myself count on things that could leave. I'm telling you this because it matters to what happened next. February. The worst of winter usually breaks sometime in February, or at least you start to feel that it might someday end. The sky changes. Not warm but lighter, something coming. I was out checking the south tank one afternoon, middle of February. The land still hard and brown, but the light doing that thing where it comes in lower and stays longer. And I was thinking about spring and what needed doing, and I was thinking about Clara at the same time, which was something I'd been managing to not do too directly, and which I wasn't managing very well. The south tank was fine. On the way back I stopped the horse on the rise above the ranch yard and looked down at it. The house, the barn, the corral, the bunkhouse with its smoke going up, Tom in the yard doing something, splitting wood it looked like. Clara would be in the kitchen. Nettie probably, wherever Nettie was, which was often wherever you least expected her. It looked like a ranch should look. It looked lived in. I sat on that horse for a while. The cold was nothing. I was thinking about a thing my father had said once, when I was young and didn't have the frame to understand it. He'd said, the hardest thing for a man who's used to doing everything himself is to let someone else into the doing of it. Not because he can't trust them, because he's afraid of what it means to need someone. I wrote down. I've thought about how to tell what happened next, and I keep coming back to the plainest version, because the plainest version is the most true. I asked her if I could talk to her. We were in the kitchen after supper, children in the bunkhouse, Prute long since gone to the tack house. She was washing up. She said, go ahead. I said I didn't know the right way to say this, so I was going to say it directly. She turned around. I told her I'd been thinking about her and the children, about what came next for all of them when the spring hands came back, when Emmett came back from Tucson. I told her the arrangement as it stood was hers to end whenever she wanted. I wasn't going to pretend there wasn't more to it than the kitchen work. There was. I'd been honest about that much with myself even when I hadn't been saying it out loud. I told her I thought she was a good woman and a good mother, and that Tom was one of the best young men I'd met at any age, and that Nettie was. I didn't quite have the word. Clara said, overwhelming. I said yes. I said I knew she hadn't come here looking for anything other than shelter, and I wasn't going to make her feel like I'd been building up to something. But I also wasn't going to sit through another winter like this one and pretend I didn't know what I wanted. She was very still, drying her hands on the cloth, watching me. I said, I want you to stay, permanent. I want us to make this a home. I know you've got reasons to be careful with men, and I know I'm not a soft man, and I know this is. She crossed the kitchen, and she put her hand on my arm. Just that, her hand on my arm just above the wrist, her fingers curling around it, the cloth still in her other hand. She was looking at me the way she'd looked at me during the blizzard, directly, nothing withheld. She said, "I was wondering how long it would take you." I looked at her hand on my arm, then I looked at her face. She said, "I've been watching you for 3 months, Cal. I know what kind of man you are. I knew 6 weeks in." I said, "And?" She said, "And I'm not in the habit of walking away from something real." I put my hand over hers on my arm. We stood in the kitchen, the two of us, in the quiet of a February evening with the stove going and the lamp lit, and I thought about everything that could be said, and decided none of it needed to be said right now. Emmett came back from Tucson in March, earlier than expected, and I wasn't entirely sure how that conversation was going to go. Emmett Gale was 61 years old and had been running cattle in this territory for 30 of them, and had seen a fair number of things and had opinions about most of them. He was not a sentimental man, but he was a fair one, and there's a difference. He'd trusted me with his ranch for a long time, and I'd never given him reason to regret it. I told him the situation straight, the way you tell a man who deserves a straight telling. I told him about finding Clara and the children in the bunkhouse, about Prout, about the winter, about the letter to his lawyer which I said I'd reimburse him for if he felt that was appropriate. He listened to all of it. Then he said, "And where do things stand now?" I told him. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Well." He said, "The foreman I had before you, Lassiter, he was here 14 years, and the only time he was worth a damn was the 4 years he was married. And after his wife died, he went sideways by degrees, and I finally had to let him go, and I've always felt bad about that." He said, "A man running a place like this, he needs something that isn't the work." He looked at me. He said, "The bunkhouse is yours to use as you see fit. We'll talk about the main house when the time comes." That was that. Spring came the way it does, all at once, and then too much of it at once. Mud and green and the hands coming back, and the ranch filling up with noise and activity after the long quiet. The hands arrived in pairs and threes over the course of a week. 6 of them in total, men I'd worked with for years, some going back to my first season on the Gale spread. Hard men, most of them, in the way ranch hands are hard, not mean but wearing, the way anything is worn by a lot of weather and a lot of work. They were used to a ranch that operated in a certain way, which was to say quietly and with me running it and not much else. The first morning with the full crew, Clara set out breakfast for 8 instead of 4, and she did it without a word to me and without looking like it was anything other than what it was. 8 plates, 8 cups, enough food to fill 8 men who'd been riding since before light. She'd gotten up at 4 to do it, and I knew that because I'd come into the kitchen at 4:30 and found it already warm and the coffee already on, and her, at the stove, moving the way she moved when she was working, efficiently, without wasted motion. The hands came in and took their hats off, which was right, and sat down, which was right, and ate without commentary, which was very right. A few of them looked at me with a question on their faces. I looked back at them without answering it. After a man named Dix, who'd been with the Gale spread 8 years, and who I trusted as well as I trusted anybody, found me at the barn. He said so. I said so. He scratched his jaw. He said, "She cooks better than you." I said that wasn't a high bar. He said, "No, I mean she cooks real well." He paused. He said, "Those kids hers." I told him about the situation. Not everything, but enough. Husband gone, legal trouble over a property. She'd come looking for work, and I'd put her in the bunkhouse through the winter, and she'd been doing the cooking and keeping the house. Dix listened. Then he said, "And?" I said, "And she's going to stay on." Dix nodded. He didn't say anything more about it. Later I saw him tip his hat at Clara when she came through the yard, and after that the other hands did the same, because Dix had been there 8 years and the others watched what Dix did. I introduced Clara to the returning hands as the ranch cook and housekeeper, which was true, and to Emmett as someone he'd be glad to have on the place, which was also true. Nobody asked more than that, and I didn't offer it. Tom attached himself to me in the spring the way he had all winter, but differently now, less like a boy following a man, and more like an apprentice following a man he'd chosen. In early April, before the full push of the spring work, I took him out on a ride to check the East Range. Not a chore that needed 2 people. I could have gone alone and been back in half a day. But I saddled the old Pinto that had been standing idle all winter and told Tom to get his coat, and he was on that horse in under 3 minutes, which told me he'd been waiting to be asked. We rode out of the yard in the early morning, the air still cool but with that spring quality underneath, that sense of something pressed tight getting ready to open. The land was brown and wet from the thaw, the grass just beginning to show in the lower spots where the runoff collected. The sky was pale and wide. Tom didn't talk for the first mile, which was right. A boy who knows when to be quiet is worth twice a boy who doesn't. After a while he said, "How many cattle do you hold out here?" I told him. He asked how I kept count. I told him about tallying, the system I used, the marks I kept, how you worked the count at roundup against what the range could carry. He listened the way he always listened, like he was building something in his head while you talked, fitting the piece you were giving him into an architecture he was already assembling. He asked what happened when the count came out short. I said you looked for them. Or you looked for sign of what happened to them. He said, "What kind of sign?" I said it depended. I said a wolf take looks different from a snake bite, looks different from a cow that's just wandered through a fence. I said the land tells you most of what you need to know if you look at it right. He said, "How do you learn to look at it right?" I said, "You come out on it enough times that you stop seeing what you expect to see and start seeing what's there." He thought about that for a while. Then he said, "That's what you do with the horses too. Stop seeing what you expect." I looked over at him. He was watching the ground ahead of his horse with those serious eyes, not looking at me, and I thought, this boy is going to be something. Not in the overblown way you say that. In the plain way that means it. I said, "Yeah, that's what you do." We found the fence down in one section on the east side. A post had heaved in the thaw, and I let Tom hand me tools and hold the wire while I drove the post back and retentioned the line. He didn't need to be shown twice what to do. He was already learning to read my movements, to anticipate what I needed next, the way good help does. We ate lunch sitting on a rise above the east tank, the 2 of us. Biscuits Clara had put in a cloth in my saddlebag without being asked. Below us the tank was full from the thaw and a dozen head were watering at the near edge, and the sky was doing that enormous thing the sky does in open country when the weather is good, all that blue going straight up into nothing. Tom said, "I want to be a rancher." I didn't say anything for a moment. He said, "Not someone else's rancher, my own." I said, "Then that's what you'll be." He looked at me. He said, "You think so?" I said, "I think you've been working toward it since you were 9 years old and you didn't know it." I said, "A man who can read the ground and read a horse and read a fence and isn't afraid of the work, there's room for that man in this country. There's always room for that man." He looked back out over the range. He had that look on his face, not quite a smile, something quieter and more permanent, the look of a thing being settled. We rode back in the late afternoon. The light was long and low, and the shadows of the horses stretched out ahead of us on the ground. I thought about my father bringing me out on my first real ride when I was not much older than Tom, the way the land looked that day, the way I'd felt. Some things pass straight down, man to man, without being named. There's a distinction. The first one is need. The second one is respect. I knew the difference when I saw it. He was good with horses. Better than good, he had something natural, a kind of patience and steadiness that horses respond to, the same quality his mother had. I started letting him work the younger horses with me, and he was careful and he listened, and he never moved faster than the situation called for, which is the main thing. One afternoon in April, he was working a young gelding in the round pen, and I was watching from the rail, and Clara came up beside me. She did that sometimes, came to where I was working and stood nearby and watched, not needing to be in the middle of it. I'd come to understand it as her version of company, of being near without imposing. We watched Tom with the horse for a while. She said he talks about you at night, when he thinks I'm asleep. I said, what does he say? She said he says things like, Cal said you have to read the ground before you trust it with a post. And Cal said a horse that won't look at you hasn't decided about you yet. She paused. She said, he said you told him a man who can't wait can't do good work. I said I probably had said that. She said he believes it. He believes everything you say. You know that. I was quiet a moment, then I said I know. She put her hand on the rail next to mine, not touching, just there. She said, I want you to know what that means to me, what you've given him. I don't have a way to pay that back. I said, you don't owe me anything. She said, I know I don't. That's what makes it. She stopped, started again. She said, when everything went wrong after Daniel died, I thought the thing I had to protect most was them from the world. Keep them close and keep things out. And then you showed up chasing a draft through a bunkhouse door, and you've been letting the world in, the right parts of it, ever since. And I didn't know how to do that for them, how to let the right parts in. Tom got the gelding to lower his head and stand still. It's a small thing if you don't know horses. If you do, you know it's the horse choosing to trust, and it's not a small thing at all. I said, you did fine. You kept them alive and whole through a hard year. She said, you're being generous. I said, I'm being accurate. She turned and looked at me, that steady look. She said, I love you, Cal. She said it the way she said most things, plainly, without ornamentation, like a thing that was true and didn't need dressing up. I looked at her. The afternoon light was long and gold, the way April light gets in the late afternoon, and it was on her face and on her hair and on her hands on the rail. I said, I know. She made a sound, not quite a laugh, and said, that's not an answer. I said, yes it is. She looked at me for another moment. Then she looked back at the pen, where Tom was walking the gelding in a slow circle, and I could see her smiling even from the side. I put my hand over hers on the rail. We got married in May. Not a big thing. Emmett stood up with me, and a neighbor woman named Holt who'd made friends with Clara stood up with her, and we did it in front of the county judge in Redfield on a Thursday afternoon, and then drove back to the ranch, and Clara made a supper that was, by general agreement of everyone who ate it, the best thing most of them had had in years. Tom shook my hand afterward, formal, two-handed, the way a young man shakes hands when he means something by it. He looked me in the eye and he said, I'm glad. That was all, I'm glad. I held on to that. Nettie, who had recently discovered that she could express most of her emotional states by running very fast and then stopping abruptly, expressed herself accordingly, and then fell asleep on the porch at 7 o'clock in the evening and had to be carried in. I want to tell you about one night that fall, not because it's dramatic, it isn't particularly, but because it's the one I come back to. September, the first cool night after the long summer. I'd been out late finishing a section of fence on the South Range, same fence I always seemed to be finishing or starting, and I came in well after dark and put the horse up and walked across the yard. The main house was lit, Clara's lamp in the kitchen. Through the window I could see her at the table, sitting, not working, which was unusual, just sitting with a cup and her own thoughts. The window had that gold look windows have from outside at night when there's warmth behind them. I stood in the yard for a moment. I'd been on this ranch for years before this. I'd crossed this yard 10,000 times and I knew every inch of it. The ground was the same ground. The house was the same house. But I was not the same man. That sounds like a thing you'd read somewhere, a tidy summation, the kind of thing the Bible I work from calls a thematic bow. I don't mean it that way. I mean it as a plain fact, the way the fence being solid is a plain fact, the way the water in the tank being a certain level is a plain fact. Measurable. Real. I'd been a man who ran things well and asked nothing, who kept his head down and did the work and let the years go where they went. I told myself that was enough, and on most days I'd believed it, and on the days I hadn't believed it, I'd found something to fix or mend or build until I'd talked myself back into believing it. What I had now was different in kind, not just in degree. It was the difference between a shelter and a home. A shelter keeps the weather out. A home is something you come back to that knows you're coming. I crossed the yard, opened the door. Clara looked up from her cup. Not startled, she'd heard my boots on the step. She always heard. She had a way of looking at me when I came in from the range, a look I can't entirely describe. It was checking, making sure I was all in one piece, and then something else, something that settled, that said, "Good, you're back, that's right." I hung my coat. She got up and got the coffee without asking, put it on the table, sat back down. I sat across from her. She said, "Long day." I said, "Long enough." She looked at me across the table, the lamp between us. The house quiet except for the sound of the children sleeping in the back, which was a particular kind of quiet, the kind that has weight and warmth to it. She said, "Tom fixed the latch on the bunkhouse door today, by himself. He figured it out." I said, "Did he do it right?" She said it opened and closed 6 times. I watched him test it. I said, "Then he did it right." She smiled. The kind of smile that's not for anyone's benefit, not performed, just what's there when something is good. We sat with our coffee. Outside, the first cool of fall was settling over the range, over the cattle on the south pasture, over the fence I'd just spent the afternoon mending, over the whole spread that I tended and kept and had given years of my life to. And in here was this, a table, a lamp, a good woman across from it who looked at me like I was worth looking at, children asleep in the back. The work done for today and more waiting tomorrow, and that being, for the first time in a long time, exactly what I wanted. She reached across the table and touched the back of my hand, just briefly, her fingers against my knuckles. She said, "You look tired." I told her I was fine. She said, "I know you are." I said, "You look tired, not that you're not fine." She looked at me evenly. She said, "You're allowed to be tired, Cal. You've been running things since before I got here and you haven't stopped once." I said, "That's the job." She said, "It's also allowed to be hard sometimes." That's what I'm saying. I looked at her hand near mine on the table. I said, "Clara." She said, "What?" I said, "I'm glad you ended up in that bunkhouse." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The worst night of my life was the night we came in here. I sat on that floor after the children were asleep and I thought," she paused. She said, "I thought there isn't going to be anything at the end of this. I'd been holding on for so long and I thought, what if there isn't anything to hold on toward?" I didn't say anything. She said, "And then you knocked on the door, and you said you weren't going to hurt anyone before you even came in." She looked at me. She said, "I remember that. I've thought about that every day since. The fact that you thought to say it." I said I hadn't thought about it, it had just seemed right. She said, "That's why I remember it." The lamp between us, the dark outside, the children sleeping, the cool that came under the door a little because it always came under the door a little, and it didn't matter because the inside was warm. I turned my hand over under hers. She looked down at our hands. Then she looked up at me, and she was smiling, and her eyes were bright, and she looked like a woman who has come a long way and arrived somewhere real. I thought about the man I'd been 2 years ago, standing in this kitchen alone, stuffing a feed sack against a gap in the door, nobody to be home for, nothing waiting for me but more of the same. A capable man, a competent man, a man nobody needed. And then a draft through a door, and a lamp lit in a building that was supposed to be empty, and a boy standing in the dark with a piece of pipe, and a woman with her back against the wall and her children behind her and her chin up. I squeezed her hand. Outside, the September dark lay over the range, and the cattle were settled, and the fences were holding, and the windmill on the east tank was turning in a light wind, doing what it was supposed to do, the way things do when they're right. We sat there a while longer, neither of us needing to go anywhere. That's where this ends. Not because it was over, it wasn't. It kept going, and it was good, and it kept being good, and I have no complaints about any of it. But this is the moment I come back to. The lamp, her hand, the first cool night of fall, the feeling of being a man in his own kitchen, with his own people sleeping in the next room, with a woman across the table who knew exactly who he was and had chosen him anyway. That's the whole of it, that's everything,